So yeah,
No worries.
if it's okay with you, we can start. So
Yeah.
okay. So hi everyone. Indy, my name is Josefina. I'm MDDI's coordinator. Then there's Tomas Vivanco. He's also the director of the program alongside with Tomas Diaz. And then there's Dan. He's the same tag as me, coordinator. He's the program's assistant at Fab City. So the three of us, we are the team. And then we have MDDI students and different students from other masters as well. So for students, just to know, today I'm going to do a brief presentation about Indy. We've got him today. He's from Dark Matter Labs, and Dark Matter Labs brings a fresh perspective to tackling global challenges with a new civic economy, giving top priority to mental well-being and pushing for nature-based solutions as game changers. Indy, he's not only an acclaimed architect, but he's also the co-founder of 00, and he's the brains behind ventures like Impact Hub Westminster and the creative mind fueling projects like WikiHouse and OpenDesk. As the driving force behind Dark Matters, he's all about constructing institutional infrastructures for radical civic societies worldwide. So thank you, Indy, for being here with us, and the space is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Delighted to be here, and apologies for being late to everyone. So what I want to use this conversation for is to challenge what I think is the scope of design and what it looks like over the next few years. And I want to challenge some of the orthodoxies of what I think the constraint spaces and how they are being transformed around us. And what they start to mean when we start to think about the future. I think many people are underestimating the scale of the transformation that we're facing, and the kind of magnitude of what that means for our environment around us, and also what it means for us as designers in different formats. So that's going to be the scope. I'm not going to massively present, this is Dark Matter Labs work, but I want to show you the scope and the space that I think is going to become critical, and the work that, I can sort of indicate where we are in terms of what that starts to mean. Just to give you a bit of background, Dark Matter Labs, we're about 65 people, full-time, from working from Montreal to South Korea. We have finance people, data scientists, geographers, designers. So we're quite different. We're policy people. We are working both all the way from the European Commission on net zero cities and the transition of European cities, to working with Indigenous partners in places like Halifax in Canada, looking at how do you make land self-owning, and all the way through to working with cities like Stuttgart to build the tree canopy and building a new investment structures for the tree canopy of Stuttgart, to building new forms of investment mechanisms to look at the collective intelligence of the city. How do you finance the collective intelligence of the city? So that's just to give you a kind of a little bit of scope and the frame. We're not I think we typically resist calling ourselves a design studio. We probably even hate the word, as in sort of the glorification of design as the means. I just think it's kind of worth you guys knowing that we're more focused on the outcomes rather than the glorification of the discipline. We can get into some of those things as well. Just some unusual things about us are that the highest paid and lowest paid employee in DM is 2-to-1 ratio. We've also structured it so that the highest paid employee is not the CEO or what would be traditionally seen as a CEO. The pay is a means to unlock the full capacity of people. So we use a different model. We organize in a way that we're a learning-oriented institution. So we believe control isn't the mechanism of organizing complex things. We focus on learning as a pedagogic structure of coherence. So we're changing the nature of how we work. We don't believe interdisciplinary nature is like, an architect and engineer. but more fully kind of actually finance institutions and other frameworks. So just to give you a kind of little bit of flavor into the background of the institution, we are a not-for-profit structure. We have 5 legal entities around the world. Just to give you a little bit of flavor around that. Now I'm going to just jump into actually some of the conversations that I really want to have, which is like why I think what the scale of the future is and what the transition is. And we can then hopefully what I'll do is I'm going to do that for about 40 minutes. So I'm going to get into that. And then what I'm hoping is we can have a bit of a conversation and get some of your feedback and get some of your reflections on that, onto those frameworks. Is that okay as a process? Is that reasonable? Yeah, great. Thank you, guys. I'm going to just share screen. And give me a second. Hopefully, is that working? Let's just see if that's working. Share screen. Start broadcast. 1, 2, 3. Good. Now do this. Okay. I assume you can see my screen. Could someone just say yes, if you can?
Yes.
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 Yeah. Perfect. Great. I just don't get that direct feedback, so it's useful. Okay, friends. So really, I want to focus on this. What does a decade of deep transition mean in this world? How many of you are vegan? Love to hear. Excellent. Congratulations. You are the future. And I think it's really important. So I want to start with this drawing because I think this is really important. So the green spaces on the left are all the wild animals in the world, which is the zebras, the elephants, the wolves, whatever you like. That's the stuff on the left, the small dots at the bottom. The wild birds you see there, that's all the wild birds in the world. And what you can see is, chickens outweigh all the wild birds in the world. And why I think this is important is it sort of allows us to understand that effectively the world is a farm, and on that farm there's a little zoo where we have wild animals. And when people talk about the Anthropocene, if you look at the world through the lens of it being a farm, you start to see this. And then it's also worth us recognizing that something like 80% of our forest destruction is driven by our food systems. 80% of our forest destruction is driven by our food systems. And I think it's also then worth recognizing that our food systems are becoming increasingly fragile as a result of climate change. So what we're about to see is pretty significant. So between 1.7 to 1.9 degrees, we're going to lose one of the major food baskets in the world, and we're seeing increasing fragility in our food systems. India, as many of you may have seen, banned the exports of rice this year. We're seeing greater volatility of our food systems. Food prices, I don't think they've done the same in Spain, but many other parts of the world have gone up nearly 40%. So we've seen food price inflation being pretty significant, and that's starting to massively increase inequality and other frameworks. And this all sits on actually a kind of a worldview, which I think is worth us recognizing. And why I'm bringing this up is I think if we want to talk about the nature of the change, I think this is one of the key dimensions that's going to guide it. And I'll bring this back up later. Connected to this is then actually what we've got is a systemic destruction of our topsoil. So what we're seeing is pretty significant effects on topsoil. Many places have less than between 40 to 60 crop years left in the soil as we're depleting it very significantly. Where in oceans, we've got rapid acidification, oxygen loss, and loss of fishing capacities. Biodiversity losses, we're sort of 1,000 times faster than normal and exceed almost all previous die-offs, other than effectively the big 5 meteorite hits that hit the Earth, or 5 or 6. So what you start to see is that the kind of where we are in the context of the scale of the transformation. Fishing, dead zones, 40% decrease in plankton. So what we've got is a kind of systemic depletion, not only of soils, but also plankton, and actually large amounts of dead zones emerging around the world. toxification. Most of us now have microplastics in our bloodstream. Pretty much all the biosphere is now contaminated with some of the synthetic materials, nanomaterials, and heavy metals. So just for us to kind of get an idea of the externalities that we're operating in. And this needs to be situated in a context that, I don't know how many of you saw the Argentinian Prime Minister's speech at WEF. Did anyone see it?
I did. I am Argentinian.
Good, good. I'm
Also,
glad you, but
yeah,
it was worth watching because, you know, he makes a very interesting point, which is that between the 1850s, we basically have in the last 200 years or so vastly increased GDP and many other effects in society, but it's almost one-to-one correlated with the discovery of hydrocarbon energy. So what you find is that we've seen a massive explosion of hydrocarbon energy since about 1850. And that energy is one-to-one correlated with effectively civilization complexity. And what we've got is a challenge that in 2019 to 2020, just to give you an idea, the global increase in energy demand, the increase in demand in that 1 year was equivalent to all the installed renewables in history. So we're increasing energy demand, and most of our renewables, if not all of them, are largely dealing with the increase in demand, but they're not dealing with actually the base demand that we've got historically. So just for us to have an idea of the quantum of energy transitions that we're facing. At the same time, what we've got is a shift in the density of energy available and the return on energy. So in 1920s, for example, it would metaphorically take 1 barrel of oil to get 120 barrels of oil. Now it takes 1 barrel of oil to get 5 barrels of oil. So in terms of actually the return on energy, so you put in energy, you get out energy, that has gone down massively, and that we're already way off the peak. So it was 1 barrel of oil would release 120. Now it's 1 barrel of oil releases 7. So the amount of energy we're having to pump in to get the energy out is extraordinary. And the same applies for our food system. Our food systems were historically energy exothermic. They would provide us energy. Now they consume more energy than they provide. So it's just worth us knowing what the scale is. And then the other part is that, and this is stuff that you guys will be very familiar with, is that if you include scope 1, 2, and 3, what you start to realize is that carbon emissions, materials, population, and GDP are one correlated. So what you have is effectively a situation where our environment, our GDP growth is correlated with material acceleration. And why that's important is when people talk about 2% growth in our economies, what they're really also talking about is doubling of our material demand in 25 years. So that's what 2.5% growth means, is the doubling of your material demand. And we know 80% of our biodiversity losses are linked to material mining and other infrastructure. And so it's just worth us recognizing this. Everyone talks about circularity. It's a little bit like teenage sex, as in that the reality is Denmark, one of the most circular economies in the world, is only about 4% circular. In the advanced economies, is only about 4% circular. So what you've got is a problem that we are nowhere close to material circularity, not even marginally close. Not even like we can talk about it. It's nice and fun, but we're factor folds off talking about what this really means. And it's declining, by the way. That's the other part of the problem. Actually, material circularity is declining, not increasing. And it's worth situating that in a more macro context, which is to say, where are we? We're currently, in terms of temperature rise, I think we exceeded base of 1.3 this year. 1.3 degrees centigrade. And what we are currently expecting is between 2.7 to 3.1 degrees, certainly, if not more. So 2.7 to 3.1 degrees is currently the landscape that we're operating in. Now, what does that world mean if you're operating in a 3-degree paradigm? Well, 3-degree global average means 5 degrees land temperatures, and that means 8 degrees in urban environments. Now, as many of you will know, that sort of, and just to put that in context, so between about 1.7 to 1.9 degrees, we lose one of the major 5 food baskets. So these sort of numbers are extraordinary in terms of their impact and catastrophic in terms of their effects. And what this means at a global level is that we're going to move vast amounts of territory outside historical human niche zones, i.e. where humans can survive. So vast amounts of territory at the global level becomes actually unviable, and you see parts of Spain all the way through to all over the world, parts of the US, vast parts of India, and other landscapes, and so obviously South America, Latin America, becomes unviable and becomes outside human niche zone. This is by 2070, and it's warmings of between 2 and 2.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So why I'm saying this is this starts to mean that when people say, oh, we're going to see climate refugees, what they're talking about is vast movements of people, and put that into context. We've currently already living with more people who are displaced than at World War II. That's currently the normal that's already in play, and what we're anticipating. And also worth recognizing that because climate breakdown is effectively an increase in energy in the weather system, heat is only one dimension. Obviously, you get rainfall, you get other forms of winds and hurricanes, so you get a highly energized weather system and highly more unpredictable weather system. So the heat is just a proxy. And the context that it sits in is this, right? So I've got multiple accords, multiple things going on, but actually very, very little dent relative to the kind of challenge that we're in the middle of. So why am I talking about all this? Well, one, I think designers need to understand the context. I mean, I just came out of a meeting where for a significant design institution, and they were saying, oh, we're going to, we're trying to prototype some new materials for large scale housing. I was like, that's great, but we don't actually have the material carbon budgets. So just to give you an idea, how many homes do you think all of Europe can afford to build if it follows the Paris Accord? Just to have an idea, just numbers. And the Paris Accord is signed up by every country in Europe. So how many homes do you think all of Europe can afford to build if it follows the Paris Accord? Some numbers, suggestions, friends. Open your mics and just say it.
Maybe 70% less than the current.
70% less? Okay. It's 90% less. So between 1.5 million and it can afford to build 144,000. Right? 144,000, just to give you an idea, the UK alone is trying to build 350,000 homes a year. Germany has over 400,000. And so why I'm saying this is that, the kind of idea of the world that we're operating in, I think there's a sort of a design illusion going on as we're not understanding the systemic constraints that are actually throttling our realities. And recognizing that these choices have systemic, we're no longer living just in a climate breakdown issue. We're living in a systemic series of crises at the fundamental level in terms of human capacity, human function, cognitive capabilities, all the way through to energy, material, nutrition. These things are coming together at a fundamental level. Things that I think worth you being precise on. You'll notice I try to resist the word climate change, but talk about climate breakdown. Climate is the theory of predictable weather, i.e. when weather is predictable, you have a climate. The loss of predictability is what we're seeing as a result of increasing the energy in our atmosphere. And the loss of predictability means also the loss of insurability. And the loss of insurability means the loss of capital markets. Now, you'll say, why is that important? Well, if you are buying a house in some parts of Australia, the insurance is $500,000 a year. Or in parts of Nova Scotia, you can't even get insurance. So what we're seeing is parts of the world are now becoming non-insurable. And if you can't get insurance, you can't get a mortgage, you can't borrow money for buying that house. And we're starting to see that being a systemic issue. And we need to start to think about what that world means in terms of implications. Also, what this means is that we have to start to recognize that not only are we living in a multipolar world, i.e., a transition from a Middle East perspective will be fundamentally different from a transition from a European perspective, will be fundamentally different from an American perspective. And it's important that COP28, we started to recognize that that's what we're facing. An American transition is almost certainly an asset and investment-based transition. A European transition, certainly ideologically, is based on, yes, transition of supply and transition of demand, so actually shifting demand on those sides and shifting how we live, and a sort of a Middle Eastern transition, which is focused on, which has very cheap hydrocarbon energy, is going to perhaps be carry on producing hydrocarbon energy and focusing on carbon sequestration and terraforming and geoterraforming in some fashion. So we're going to see different strategies come to play around the world based on context. And I think we're going to have to start to live not in a single polar worldview of what the transition looks like, but actually a multi-perspectival worldview of what that transition looks like based on context. And that's something that I think we're going to have to face up to and what the implications are. And just to give you an idea, and I'm not in any way advocating for this, but just worth you knowing that there is a lot of research going on, for example, of solar dimming, where you put small particulates, sulfur particulates in the air to actually take temperatures down by 1 degree. And the sulfur particulates, for example, would cost about $1 billion a year to put up. There's probably 5 or 6 countries that can do it because of where the solar particulates need to be released. It does actually create volatility in our weather system, so it does have weather system shift effects. Yet it's $1 billion a year to be able to maintain that. So people are already starting to think about planetary terraforming and what that starts to mean and adjustments into those perspectives. And different societies will have different views on these sorts of frameworks, and something that I think we're going to have to become more smarter about. Next, I think it's worth just recognizing, and this is usually, is that the domain of security, everything is increasingly being examined from a security lens. So whether it's food, whether it's energy, whether it's water systems, whether it's critical minerals, we're seeing them shift away from free trade and trade as a commodity framework to a security framework. And what does that start to mean to how we organize stuff, and what that starts to mean? A lot of our friends, when we were, maybe sort of right at the beginning of the story, would talk about open source and open data and other infrastructures. Yet in a kind of increasingly geopolitical world, which is increasingly in some form of kind of security risk, these things are starting to become more and more challenging. So what does this securitization of the world look like, and what is the implications? And I just put that forward to see. Other things that I think we need to recognize is that it increasingly, if we're going to build any form of transition capacity, there's going to have to be some form of justice or truth and reconciliation of historic injustices. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to move people forward. And this goes within countries as it goes across countries. And as we see inequality rise within countries as a result of some of the risks that are on the table, our ability to construct new consensuses is becoming more and more difficult. So what does this sort of, what sort of technologies and what sort of futures we advocate, and how do they drive not just transition, but also just transitions, become increasingly critical. So it's in this reality that I want to say that actually what's really clear is that the transition we're facing is of the order of the Industrial Revolution. We're facing fundamentally an energy transition, yes. We're facing a material transformation and transition from we're going to have to move from a material economy to an intangibles economy. We're going to have to move towards a durable materials economy. We're going to have to move towards a biomaterial economy. So just to give you an idea that, everyone says, oh, I'm going to build a low carbon house. I'm going to build it out of timber. that's brilliant. But the reality is, if your timber is coming from global timber supply, which it typically is, that's typically just a 5% reduction in carbon. We need a 95% reduction in carbon. In order to deliver that, you not only need decarbonized supply chains, but you also need biomaterial, bioregional supply chains, which are adjacent to the demand. So we're going to see quite a fundamental shift, both in sort of moving towards an intangibles economy, a durable economy in terms of how we maintain our buildings for not 25 years, but actually 100-year infrastructures, how do you drive durability, and then also moving towards a fully biomaterial economy. Also, if you look at any of the human cognitive stuff that's going on, human machine capabilities are going to open up a new human development landscape. So what does that open up? And I think that's going to be a key part of the transition. Our food systems and nutrition and protein systems are under radical transformation. We're going to be having to look at a new food mix, which will almost certainly be some degrees of rewilded food systems, controlled environment food systems like we already see, as well as actually moving towards some degree of sort of VAT-grown food systems. So what does that food system economy look like, and how do we build that? And then rebuilding biointegrity. So you've seen many of these things are going on about releasing 50% of the land towards rebuilding biointegrity. We are going to have to rebuild our biointegrity if we're going to deal with some of the climate change effects that we're looking at, and rebuilding that is going to be a key part of the transition. So I want to play this out, because I think what this starts to mean is quite a fundamental landscape scale transformation of our places and cities. And I think we're underestimating the scale and scope of this transition. Again, I'll just jump past that. And this starts to ask more fundamental questions, like what do we value? So, for example, a tree, an urban tree outside, your street, for example, is a cost. It's an insurance cost, it's a maintenance cost, but its ecological benefits are not accrued or agglomerated. So there are some really key questions about how we value things. Many of you will have read, I hope, that a whale, for example, that's alive in the water is worth nothing, whereas a whale that is captured and dead is worth something. So we predicated an economy towards a very particular type of capture. An urban tree is worth nothing, maybe the timber is worth something. And that is incentivized a means of orchestration and allocation of resources, which is fundamentally problematic. So how do we start to understand the benefits of a tree canopy of a city in terms of energy savings, carbon sequestration, flood risk management, air quality, all sorts of other first-order benefits, as well as second-order benefits? How do we start to value and understand these things? And, in a simple sense, if you have an apple and you have a can of cola, our economy prefers the can of cola because it's addictive. It's a fixed unit cost. It externalizes vast amounts of costs into the environment which aren't priced, whereas a sustainable apple which restores the soil is not valued in the same framework. So the question is, how do we shift from an economy gearing towards a cola versus economy gearing towards flourishing of its adjacent assets, like a sustainable apple or an orange, or whichever way you look at it. And the question right now we're facing is, our economy is geared towards the cola, and that is actually fundamentally not only just dealing with sort of direct impacts to us, but also the kind of negative externalities that are accruing at a planetary scale, which are then self-terminating us. And this can also be seen from a positive spillover effect. We did the work on the High Line, where it took something like 174 million dollars of investment, and it raised 3.4 billion of property land value uplift adjacent to it, and within 500 meters. So you saw that these spillover effects can be positive and negative, and we increasingly need an economy that's able to understand these positive and negative spillover effects. And just to give you the quantum, to construct 187 million, public funding 75% of that, that was the land value increase, which was 3.4 billion, and this was the total tax. So this was entire privatization of value. So how do we start to not only sort of share that uplift, but also manage their negative externalities in different formats? And we've been building some of the processes to deal with that. And this applies to trees in terms of second and spillover values. It applies to other forms of objects in terms of houses and other frameworks. So my big thing to you is not only are we facing, yes, how do societies make decisions, the mental health of society, food systems, these sort of transformations of systemic rewilding, we're also facing new forms of fundamental questions about how we account for value, new forms of permission spaces, new forms of contracting spaces, new forms of data infrastructures that are required for these transitions. And many of these things are looking no longer at startups, but infrastructures. So the tree canopy of a whole city, as opposed to an urban forest, the deep retrofitting of a whole city, the mental health of a whole city. These sort of infrastructure level moments, I think, are becoming really key. So, to put an analogy, we're no longer in the time of inventing light bulbs. We're in the moment of the electrification of cities. So it's that infrastructure level frameworks that are critical. These infrastructures are multiple partners who are building those infrastructures and multiple beneficiaries. So multiple beneficiaries and multiple liability owners, which are being mapped in new forms of ways. So how do we start to think about this new form of infrastructure provision? And we're doing a lot of work around this. And this opens up all sorts of questions about, who are the instigators, new forms of procurement mechanisms, new forms of permission systems, new forms of data infrastructure, new forms of kind of pooling mechanisms for shared liability. But what you start to find is there's a lot of dark matter work that's required at the institutional level to be able to manifest those futures. And this is my sort of close to my final point, is that behind what looks like obvious solutions, and if you look at the nature of these solutions, they're very particular. They're multi-solving solutions. A tree canopy isn't about the tree canopy. It addresses heat. It addresses sort of flooding risk. It addresses air quality. It also addresses, if it's done well, community cohesion. It also addresses new forms of mobility shifts. So we need to start to think about solutions as multi-solving solutions. But these multi-solving solutions end up with structural questions into the dark matter of the institutions behind them. And they ask questions as to how we think at the structural level, at the conceptual level of what where value lies and how do we organize that value. And that's becoming more and more apparent. So the failures that we see are rooted in symptoms, and they ask open questions about actually some of the structural ideas of property, ideas of financing, ideas of labor, and how do they construct themselves. And what I would say is the innovation is not the tree canopy. The innovation is in the bureaucratic landscape. The innovation is in the governance landscape. The innovation is in the financing landscape and the social norms and perceptions and participations into those frameworks. So the deep code innovations are critical to manifesting these visible formations. I'm nearly coming to an end, so thank you for your patience. But I think the question that most deeply sits at the root of this is that I think the transition we're facing is a transition in our relationship with the planet. And our relationship with the planet is largely being that of what I would say is simple causality, so we would optimize an interaction, which then creates vast forms of externality. And over time, those externalities like CO2, like soil erosion, are terminating us. But we have to recognize we're no longer living in asymmetric causalities, but living genuinely in entanglements. And this is where we have to move away from the single point optimization. Does not work. And how do we operate in a multi-solving sense becomes really critical. And you start to see, I think historically, but also now, you're starting to see different relationships of the world become critical, and the rights of nature movement where rivers become self-sovereign. This agentification of the world becomes a key part of dealing with this framework. And it's not just the sovereignty, it's the agentification. Then the agent becomes a learning agent. So you become into treaty with something rather than being able to instruct it. This agentification of the worldview allows us to deal with complexity in a fundamentally different way. And this is some beautiful stuff that, we're working on a house which owns itself, but even the language of materiality moves away from theories of ownership through theories of permissions and sharing and borrowing in new ways. And it opens up new cartographies of our relationship with the land. This is Turtle Island or the North America, and it sort of opens up a question about how we relate to land. And this is multiple nations which are overlapping on geographies, and how those overlapping geographies coexisted. So how do we start to think about a nation state, not even just as territory, as physical territory, but as this overlapping custodians of land? What is our relationship to those frameworks? And how do we challenge some of these things? You've probably seen a project like this, the Embassy of the North Sea, to challenging other things like, what if a forest was self-sovereign? What if a building was self-sovereign? What if the camera was self-sovereign? And then moving away from this pyramidical ownership theory of as a means of stewardship to a relationship and territorial theory. But the ownership model relies on actually us being able to control the world around us, to be in dominion, and the rest, everything else is in service to us. Whereas the other worldview allows us to recognize the world as agent, and we're in relationship to it. We can't understand the complexity, but we can work didactically with the complexity. And that, to me, opens up some of the kind of real structural questions that are available in the work that we're doing. And I think, and at the center of this transition, whether it's an energy, material, protein, human development transition, is also recognizing a pathway to a new type of growth, a growth which isn't linked to material demands, that cannot be sustained through material extraction. It can be constrained through hydrocarbon energy systems. So what does the pathway for a new form of human civilizational development model look like, especially if we recognize that we are so planetarily entangled? And I think these sorts of questions are going to redesign the design space of innovation. And I suppose my number one thing here is just actually getting to the question about what is the design space we're operating in? What is the space of actual intervention? What are the illusions that we're operating in that feel convenient, but not responsible to the scale of change that's on the table? So with that, I'll come to an end so we can have a bit of Q&A and discussion, hopefully. But that hopefully gives you a framework of how we're starting to see the world and the landscape we're starting to operate in. Again, open to discussions and hopefully a little bit of debate. And also, that please don't, you don't have to agree with all of this. And also, this is driven through a European perspective right now. There are different economies which have different material demands and different material justice situations. So if you're operating in India, for example, there is a different material reality to actually where there is capacity for increasing material demand. So this is not a universal position of the world. It's a situational position that has to be understood in that context. Right, friends, that's me. Happy to get into discussion. I hope that's not been too boring.
I could ask a question. No, it's not boring. It's kind of just like my mind is trying to wrap itself around it all. But just a question about, so I'm coming from America. I very much see like this asset-based mindset and the problems with it. What would you say to like an average citizen of the world, I guess, or citizen of America, as to like what people could be doing to change that mindset in society?
Look, I'm trying not to work with too much prejudice in my mind about this now. I think that we might have to work with the energy that's in the room. And I think so. I was in Austin, right? I was in Austin earlier this week. I came back, and it's interesting. It's quite difficult for a European to understand this, but if you're in Austin, what we have to understand is earned wealth has more legitimate power than state public wealth, right? Earned wealth has greater legitimacy than state power. State is not seen to be as legitimate as earned wealth, right? And again, let's try not to drive this with prejudice. Let's try to understand what the psychological basis of that is. And as a result, actually family offices there can actually take quite a different form of view into the world, where they can start to look 100 years into the future in different formats. So the actors are different, the agency is different into those frameworks. So I think one of the things for us is I think there's a risk of us being. I'm very nervous right now of saying there is a prescribed reality. So if I'm in the Middle East, I recognize when your oil production is, $4 a barrel, in terms of that's what it costs to produce oil, or $2 a barrel. It's going to be very difficult to get rid of oil as your core economy. So then the question is, what is your play into this transition? And that's going to be situationally different from Europe, and it's going to be situationally different from America. And I think recognizing we're moving into a multipolar world, and recognizing the risks are different in different plays as well, right? So a Middle East play based on oil generates a form of planetary risk, which is that carbon sequestration doesn't work, and we are having to move towards geoengineering as a means to control that. Whereas a European pathway has another form of risk, that the demand shift doesn't work. Actually, we can't shift demand, or inequality grows too high, and social tipping points occur. So, which means that actually we lose the stability to be able to make this transition anyway. So, I think these aren't like, I'm trying to operate with, and I'm not saying I'm right here, but I'm just trying to operate with a little less kind of dominant prejudice, and trying to see where the energy is to actually be able to understand different theories of risk. So into those frameworks. So an asset-driven future can be great if you can start to perceive assets over 100 years, and it can start to look at risks to those assets. It was really interesting, even talking to family officers, one of them was saying, look, unless we can build relational wealth, i.e. wealth which is just not ours, but spilling over generative wealth to society, we will lose the legitimacy of our wealth. Yeah. So it's not that people understand from an enlightened self perspective new forms of justice as a key part of their reality. So I just want to, that's the position I'm holding. Again, not trying to be right or wrong about it. I'm just trying at this moment in time to hold a position which actually allows us to see the plurality, because I think that we've lost the idea that there will be a single transition is not on the table. I think that's gone. That world is definitely gone. We've lost the idea of a singular transition. This is multipolar, multi-pathway transitions, and they will be situationally reactive. Thanks, Elisa, for asking the question, being first. Appreciate it.
Hi, Indy, allow me to ask a few questions.
Yeah, please, Mohammed, how are you doing?
First of all, I do appreciate the great talk, and I totally agree that it's a situational transformation for each country or demography or region. It must be this way. Innovation usually operates in that format. My questions are, is climate change, I'm not speaking about pollution of any sort, just climate change. Was it inevitable and will happen by anyhow, and these setbacks just made it happen faster? I don't know the answer to this question. And from your subconscious, is there any practical solution to this challenge? And these solutions, would it be compatible with human psychology and human nature? Because we don't want to repeat previous mistakes of having solutions that are not incompatible or high compatibility with human nature and psychology.
Yeah, no, great question. In terms of climate change and in terms of, as far as I see it, the science is pretty irrefutable that this is a sort of CO2 impact-driven event, and we are releasing significant amounts of CO2 into the environment, and we're at risk of doing runaway environments, if that's your question, Mohammed. So certainly the science as I see it, I'm not a climate scientist, but I've spoken to some of the best in the world, people that are writing the IPCC reports and other people. They don't have a vested interest to not say otherwise. And I think that's pretty evident. But in terms of, it's an important philosophical question, what you're asking, because there's two aspects to it. One is, the question for me is, in there is, what is human nature? And there's a brilliant book called The Humankind, which talks about human nature is not necessarily what Homo economist is. Homo economist is the idea of narrow self-rational or self-optimizing behavior. Humans don't necessarily work that way. Actually, the reason why you could argue that most of the decisions you make are not rational decisions, they're mimetic decisions. You copy behaviors. Actually, what we have is most of the decisions that you think you make are actually mimetics, because actually the cognitive processing power to make a decision you limit for very few decisions, actually. So actually we have this illusion of rationality as a means of organizing, but actually one of the things is that. Second thing is generosity and gifting is a much higher contributional value than self-optimization. So people make decisions in a different way. So again, I would examine more deeply, would be the kind of actual, we're given usually lots of narrative, like from what I'd call really poor economic literature, typically politicized economic literature. So it's humans are self-rationalizing, they're optimized towards themselves, they're greedy by nature. The science doesn't validate that, frankly. Now, what I think is really important is that, and this is where the economic paradigm comes in, is that we often think about capitalism versus some form of collectivism. So the kind of model of conversation is the solution capitalism, individualism, or is it some form of collectivism? And I would argue both are terrible. So I think cooperatives may be as bad, his controversial take. Cooperatives and some form of collectives are equally as bad as individualism, because a cooperative externalizes, creates the other in a different landscape. So if you live in New York, maybe some of you have ever lived in New York. If you've lived in a housing, that's not called tenement, what's it called? I don't know if someone can help me, but if there's cooperative housing there, but if you don't know people inside it, you can't get in. If you don't have friends inside that, you don't get in. Mondragon, brilliant cooperative movement in the Basque Country, fantastic in Bilbao, but when they're working in India, they charge the same rates as McKinsey. So they're extractive to the context outside the situation, right? And so cooperativism is okay in the bounding operation that it operates in, but actually in the external world that it operates in, it still creates an other. The individual creates an other as well. So the challenge I think we face is to move away from a landscape of othering to a landscape of relationality. So I think the big paradigm leap we're moving away from is what I would call any form of bounded means of organizing to relational means of organizing. So this is where, if you talk about blockchains and other things, why they're interesting is they create chain models of organizing. Why open source is interesting, it creates chain models of organizing, unbounded chain models of organizing, as opposed to bounded models of organizing. So the paradigm leap is, I think, fundamentally different. And then the second point is that both collectivism and some form of, or individualism all still operate on a theory of property, still operate on a theory of labor, still operate on a theory of contract. So a commons is still divisible property, managed, shared, divisible property. Whereas actually you can, if you talk to indigenous nations, they will say a river is not property, cannot be owned. It's life in itself. It is agent in itself. So when you see something as agent as opposed to property, your relationship is not that of divisible rights, but is actually to be in treaty and relationship with its becoming. So this is a paradigm leap from seeing the world from property. And then even if you're working for a cooperative, you have an employment contract, which is actually the idea of instructable economies, i.e. the instruction. All of you will have some form of labor contract. The labor contract is I instruct you to do what you do, right? So this is a command and control economy. So it's commanding. Management is a theory of orchestration, which is still about some form of control. Now, there are other means of organizing economies and organisms, sociocracy and other things. What they're all predicated on is new forms of learning frameworks. So we're moving, I would argue, we're moving from a paradigm of property, labor, contracts as a means of control orientation to learning orientation systems. And that's not a moral agenda. It's an agenda to deal with the complexity of information. Control is very difficult to do in complex environments. Centralized control is very difficult to do in complex environments because of information overload driven through complexity. So what you need is situational, contextual, learning-oriented actors which operate with a different theory of organizing. So I think we're in a deeper paradigm shift, which challenges some of those orthodoxies in kind of radical ways. And I think that's the kind of deeper question. And there's papers that we've got coming out on some of the stuff of life-enabling economics and other things which are kind of challenging some of those orthodoxies. And that's where self-sovereign technologies or self-sovereign river systems and other things become really interesting. And that's made functional by some of the kind of technological capabilities that we now have available to us, bureaucratic technological capabilities. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Just one follow-up question.
Of course.
For this situational awareness that if I'm allowed to rephrase it this way, for learning and awareness in general, situational, of course, what's the biggest trigger for impact? Is it governments? Is it schools? Is it families? In your opinion?
It depends which stage. Right now, if you say who's the big movers right now, it's the central banks because they understand the stability risks. It's security services because they understand longitudinal risk. It's intergenerational wealth because it starts to understand the 500-year or 100-year risk to its wealth and asset theory. And then it's communities where actually these risks are becoming intersectional. So where these risks are compounding, this is where we're getting traction to these conversations. It's not the politicians. Politicians are a lagging infrastructure. The political class is a lagging infrastructure. Where the structural moves is in different holders of risk, if you can perceive it. So central banks holding financial stability risk, security systems holding security risk over indefinitely, intergenerational wealth holding 100-year risk of what it means to assets and other theories, and then communities at the intersection of these risks. And that's where we're finding the construction of new politics of change.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay, friends.
Indy? No,
yeah.
I have one question. So sorry. You were talking about this typical idea of like having two models to operating in the world somehow. On one hand, we have capitalism. On the other hand, we have, let's say, some cooperative logics, right? But you mentioned something like super interesting that is based somehow in the idea of commons, right? Of ownership. Like who owns the sunset? Actually, no one can own a sunset, right, or a sunrise. But in fact, we all own it, but without the idea of typical of the mechanical ownership, of having the sunset, of personal possession on that. So, how do you see this idea of I don't know if it is private assets or ownership in a world that should not be based anymore on this logic of binary resolutions of causes and effects, of private and public, of ownership and commons.
Yeah,
so,
I mean,
how do you see this idea of having some intermediary, like some grayscale, a new tone, new colors should start raising of this new model?
No, exactly. And I think so. That's why I think the whole illusion of public and private is just that, an illusion. So even if you have, we were talking about this, even if you have private wealth, it's not actually private, it's fundamentally entangled to society. So your wealth is perfectly correlated with society. If, for example, some people used to think that they could escape to New Zealand at the point of disaster. And then they figured out in COVID, New Zealand didn't have one paracetamol production capability, no antibiotic capabilities. It didn't have access to microchips. You start to realize very quickly, actually, your wealth, and the average lifespan of somebody in the Middle Ages was 35 without those antibiotics and other things. So what you start to very quickly realize is how entangled we are. And this is where the illusions of public and private are just that. And so I think this paradox of and property as a theory of divisibility, the construction of the objectification of things, using perspective as a means to actually objectify something, to construct distance and power and asymmetry, classification theory as a means of organizing the world that allow for divisibility and violence. These were all tools that actually were built, were accelerated at the point of the Renaissance and onwards, but are now reaching the point where the externalities are becoming so systemic that we're operating to a new world. That's where a lot of our work is right now, beyond property, beyond labor. These sort of categories are actually part of the problem space. So yeah, you can see, I think we published quite a lot of this stuff. So and I've done quite a few podcasts on some of this stuff. There's one that's just about to come out with Radical Exchange on this whole conversation of beyond property as a means of organizing. Hi, Saad, how are you doing?
All right, thank you, Andy, for messing with my mind. Not going to be able to sleep very well for a while, but the one that I'm struggling to get my head around, like what Eliza said, and struggling with this. You mentioned about the solar dimming of the planet, and I quickly looked this up, and it's the New Yorker article suggests that it's more likely depending on how things are going. I mean, I live in Singapore. I'm a degree off the equator. I would very much like to believe that this is not something you think is going to happen as an inevitability.
You want my honest answer?
Yes, please.
Okay, if it takes £1 billion a year to do 1 degree, unfortunately, I think the likelihood of it happening is pretty high. Unfortunately. And there are vast catastrophic second-order effects as a result of doing that, which is weather patterns around the world will be affected at a regional level as a result of this. So there will be, but I suspect that this will be one of those equations. And how many of you read Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry of the Future? You guys should all read that book, Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future. The reason why is he runs a scenario, and it's a really interesting scenario, where he's really interesting and really scary, where 20 million people die in India as a result of effectively a heat effect, where there's persistent heat and high humidity. Remember, if you get 100% humidity, you only need to be 38 degrees and people die, right? So it's the humidity levels. And when 20 million people die, not only is there a massive increase in global terrorism, India unilaterally decides to effectively cool the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He runs a scenario. Now, I'm not saying that's, but I do know for a fact, and I've been part of these conversations with various universities around the world, this is now an option. This is not not an option. It is being explored as an option space. And yeah, and also just to be aware, many of you will know that as a result of sort of reduction in air pollution and sulfates around the world and coal burning, we've actually increased global warming because we reduced the particulates in the air. So my big thing is we are terraforming already, right? The idea that we're not terraforming is the illusion. This is what I meant by the farming, right? So if you look at the number of air particulates in the air, that's gone down, thereby global temperatures are increasing at a higher rate. So that's research, you can just see it outlined. So I think there's a really morally interesting and difficult question coming, for us. So yeah, that's my honest view on that.
I appreciate the honesty. It's difficult, but yeah, it's something that I'm going to have to look into a little bit further. I had another quick question, if you don't mind.
Of course.
About the oil extraction, this came as a very huge, big surprise to me. But the amount of, like, the proportion 1:120 versus 1:7 or 1:5 now. Is this why all of these fossil fuel extracting companies are now investing into renewables?
Sort of, but remember, I would look underneath the numbers, right? So this is where, like what I was trying to say, we're nowhere close to the numbers of energy transitions, right? So the likelihood is, if you want my energy projection scenario, we're looking almost certainly at thorium micronuclear reactors as a key part of the energy transition. The idea that we're going to do this over wind and solar is just not enough energy in the system in our current production. And the other part of the story is that copper shortages. So don't look just at energy supply, look at copper. So we don't have enough mines available that are going to provide us the copper in the next 10 years to do the electrification that's required. So this is why the story isn't electric cars, it's almost certainly electric bikes. Because electric bikes per unit of mile traveled are one of the most efficient energy vehicles out there in the world. And they still allow you to be able to take the whole of Barcelona or any city with an economic geography which is really efficient. And so what, this is where we need to be really smart about what these transitions really look like and the electrification. So these are not linear futures. What we're going to go through is a whole bunch of volatilities. And I think we have to understand we're going to be living in a volatile landscape. And so copper supply versus long-term energy supply. If we can survive as a civilization, not blow ourselves up, within 30 years, we almost certainly have fusion and we almost certainly have high energy thorium reactors. We're into a new age of energy surplus, right? At the same time, probably in 30, 40 years, we almost certainly have access to some form of asteroid mining available to us. So we're starting to actually be able to extract minerals at a planetary scale. So I just want us to but the problem isn't 40 years. It's not a linear future. It's the volatilities as we go through in between now and then. And I think people find it difficult to think about the volatilities. And volatilities are what drives high interest rates, high inflation environments, which is what we're living in right now, right? Volatility is what drives our food prices being higher. So it's the volatility which drives inequality in the system, which brings us closer to social tipping points. So keep an eye on the volatility, not just the linear reserves. Everyone will tell you we've got enough copper reserves. Yes, we do. We just don't have the mines right now. We don't have the mines which are open, and the ecological damage of the mines when we open them is significant. And then they will tell you, just so you would know the argument, they'll say, yes, but our oil gas industry has greater mining effect than the minerals. And they are right. The unfortunate problem is we're going to have to run both for a while whilst we tail from one economy to the other. So it's it's these transitions that are really, really the management issue, not just linear projections. Cool.
Thank you.
Pleasure, of course. Anyone else, my friends? Hi, Delphina. I can't hear you. That could just be me.
Yes, sorry. You can write your question.
Yeah, of course. If someone wants to come in while Delphina's writing, feel free.
This transition, Andy, do you think it's in 2070 for the oil and the copper mining?
We don't have that long. We have, frankly, we've got to do a lot of the electrification stuff in the next 10 years. So this is where the thresholds become very difficult. So, we just don't have that scale of time if you look at the numbers. And this is what I think the challenge comes in. So yeah, it's more like 2050 maximum, at maximum levels. And even then, by the way, even now, we're relying on carbon sequestration to deal with the gases we've already put out. Just to give you an idea, Denmark has already exceeded the 1.5 degree carbon budget. So it is reliant on everything it does to sequester carbon back. So technologies which we don't even know if they work yet, right? So we are already into, sort of Santa Claus coming to save the world moments, right? Free gifts of innovation, which we don't know yet. So just so, sorry, Delphina, let me just have a look at your question. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so thank you. Look, this is partly where I was going, is that we often focus on governments, but I think governments and political systems are lagging drivers in this. What I'm seeing is the big conversations that are being had and where influence is growing, security conversations. So as people start to see systemic food volatility as a security issue, they see climate change as a security issue. So I think security conversations. Central banks are understanding massive monetary financial risks to the table. So the conversations are happening at what I'd call the hard edges of government, in a way, the structural edges of, if we were doing conspiracy theory, we'd say deep state structures, the deep state structures of government, and then also communities. And longitudinal wealth holders, because they understand and are operating a risk. The biggest problem we've got is that our governments, our political systems, do not operate at a comprehension of managing risk over longitudinal periods. Their cycles of operating in risk are 4 years, quarterly, 100 days. They operate almost in a 24-hour news cycle of risk management, as opposed to really looking at societal risks at the longitudinal level and being able to manage it. And this is one of the big challenges for democracy right now, is that democracy has become a hyper-agile system that doesn't have the decision-making structures to manage risks over the longitudinal cycle. And that's one of the big challenges that we're facing. So central banks tend not to be locked into a democratic cycle. They're public good institutions outside the democratic frame. So they're seen to serve security service outside the democratic frame for public good institutions. So it's really interesting to see where this change is being registered and where it's being organized. I also, just to be really positive about this and maybe close on the positivity on this as well, is that I think the choice that we have is mutually assured destruction, right? Or mutually assured thriving. It's a fork. It's not a spectrum. And most people sort of think of it like, oh, we might lose 7 billion people. I've sat in rooms where we said, oh, the Earth carrying capacity is 1 billion people. And I was like, well, let me break this for you. With distributed bionuclear weapons or biowarfare, distributed nuclear weapon capabilities, information weapons, other forms of weapons, there is no way that we lose 7 billion people and we're going to stop. It will almost be total systemic catastrophic. And just the impact of what's happened in Ukraine is just a really perfect example of how entangled we are at a global supply chains level and the risks it generates. So there is no pathway, in my view, of what I'd call sort of this spectrum pathway. Either we face mutually assured destruction or mutually assured thriving. And if you've read, I don't know if many of you read Novacine, by James Lovelock, the first third of it, it's extraordinary because he proposits a different idea. It says, look, human civilization of 8.2 billion people, of 8.2 billion intelligences, we've got the most extraordinary, the planet is becoming conscious, both in terms of information terms, material flow terms, informational terms, it's becoming self-aware. The planet has become self-aware. It doesn't talk about humanity, the planet itself has become self-aware. And so the other way of looking at it is that we're in this apex turning point, in this pivot point from one way of organizing, one way of seeing the world to a new way of seeing the world, which I think is really extraordinary as well. So I don't want to leave us all with sort of, I think, this has been a moment where we've used the hydrocarbon energy system to take us to a new potential capacity of a civilization. The question is, can we manifest that new capacity, or will our 18th, 17th century institutions actually fall us to erode away? So it's also a moment of great invitation and great hope, because it's something extraordinary. You are a planetary organism. It's no denying that. And that, I think, is worth us. This is why I hate all the localism stuff and the kind of and all these languages of divisibility and separation, because they start to make an assumption that you're divisible. The microchips are never going to be produced in Barcelona. They're just never going to be produced. The neon required to produce the microchips is never going to be produced in Barcelona. So we are living in some form of planetary relationship. Yes, we need to have some form of biomaterial movements of our material economy becoming more localized, more proximus. Yes, definitely. But it's still going to be in some form of planetary landscape. And I think recognizing our capacity to live in that planetary landscape is really important in terms of dealing with the entanglements in those issues. So yeah, but this is where language becomes really key, like in those transition languages. Is that okay, Delphina? Is that cool? Thank you. Pleasure. We've got about 4 minutes, so if there's any more questions, I'm happy to take them.
Is there any short-term good news?
Short-term good news. Yeah, it's an extraordinary, like, okay, as a civilization, if you want to read Gapminder, we have the lowest level of poverty that we've ever had. We've had the greatest level of increase of energy per human being that we've ever had in history. We've had the greatest level of general lifespans of humanity than we've ever had. So we can talk about the good news. The question is, so I think that is extraordinary. The collective intelligence of the planet is more extraordinary than anything else. Yeah.
In relation to the environment and climate change.
The good news for me is that we're able to have these conversations now. I think the biggest frustration for me was actually just the convenient lies we were telling ourselves. That was I still go into rooms when people say, we just got to have a more sustainable house building industry, and I'm like, do you know the numbers? And so, well, we'll build low carbon. And said, well, how low carbon will you build? And they don't actually understand embodied carbon. They don't understand the numbers. So what I'm like, the biggest issue here is actually the conversations are now being had. And I think that to me is the greatest hope. Like, the more honest we can be, the constraint space, the constraints I'm talking about are shifting the innovation space. They're not going to make us, this is an extraordinary opportunity for us to shift human development, extraordinary opportunity for us to de-instrumentalize humanity. There's an extraordinary opportunity for machine-human synthesis and cognitive capabilities. There's an extraordinary opportunity for us to be able to talk to whales, which is already going on. Like, we're living in a precipice of an extraordinary opportunity, but it has to be kind of situated in this way. Cool. Well, I hope that's messed with your design careers for the rest of your lives, because that was my real objective. Because that was my real secret objective. Because I think, I think, just to wrap up, then I think design is a really powerful skill, right? And its skill is that you can synthesize complex disciplines. That's what it relies on. And I think the real obligation for designers is to work with the fundamentals as they're emerging, and to create and to understand constraints, either shift the constraints themselves or shift where the innovation spaces are derived by those constraints, right? So if we recognize we can't for 10, 15 years have a housing economy without building new homes, then the real question becomes, how do you build spatial justice? How do you build justice in spatial use terms for people in that framework? And that requires us to reimagine the pathways of innovation in different formats. So none of these things are about, as designers, that's your obligation. Either shift the constraint space, we're going to plant more timber, we're going to build a timber economy, we're going to build a bioregional material economy locally, that's going to deal with it, and that's going to take a bit of time. And also, how do you deliver spatial justice? And I think as designers, as strategic designers as well, you have an obligation to work that way. But this requires you to be bold enough to look the problem in the eyes. If you don't, then you're part of a delusional conversation, which is convenient, political, but not very powerful or not very useful longitudinally. So I think that's a really, really my invitation to you as designers and builders of some of these futures as well. Is that all right, friends?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. We also believe that design is the tool, is the way. So thank you very much for this very, let's say, open-minded and nice insights that we're having now that we're starting the design process, right? We changed the idea of designing prototypes, like minimum viable things, objects, limited objects, into designing interventions. That means that things becomes alive because they are placed in context, they are in relation with nature, but also they are in relation with communities. So I believe that, yeah, all your experience, I know also from previous work and publications, they are incredible tools and, yeah, again, insights for students and a great inspiration for the program. So thank you very much for joining us today.
No, it's a real pleasure, and again, my apologies for being late, but thank you for all the great work you guys are doing. And like, you don't see this, please, I'm saying this stuff because I think it's going to be really interesting. It's going to be the most interesting decade that anyone's lived in, and that's a real invitation for you guys to do some extraordinary work as well. So, thank you. Thanks, friends.
Thank you, Indy. Have a great day. Thank you so
You too.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you all in the other link.
You send a new link?
For our session, our studio session, there's
Ah,
another
in the
link.
calendar, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And right in time, huh? Incredible.
Right on time. Amazing.
Right on time. We're Germans.
Yeah. See you there, guys. Ciao.